I've been feeling crashed lately, who hasn't? Before we start this review, I'll warn you all that this will largely be a newcomer's perspective on this trilogy of over 20-year-old games. I've heard plenty about them, which is unsurprising considering how much of a commercial and critical success they were back in the day, but I haven't given the games a proper go until now. With the marsupial on everyone's minds now, thanks to the release of Crash Bandicoot 4, it's about time, and that name is just a ripoff of Plants vs. Zombies 2. I figured that now would be a good time to give them a try. Also, unlike with Kirby's Adventure, where I reviewed Nightmare and Dreamland simultaneously, I won't be talking about the 2017 remakes, because discussing what's technically 6 games in one video would be a bit hectic. We'll get to Kirby Superstar and Sonic Adventure eventually. But the more honest reason is that I don't own the remakes in any form. I guess that'll give us a greater opportunity to see how the games fare on their own design merits in the year 2020, so let's begin. First in the trilogy is the original Crash Bandicoot. Already I can tell the animators knew what they were doing, just look at this title screen. Naughty Dog's best work in the actual storytelling, though, was yet to come, since the story here is incredibly basic and pretty silly compared to their later works such as Uncharted and The Last of Us, with a minimal amount of cutscenes to boot. Dr. Neocortex is experimenting on Crash Bandicoot, hoping to use him to take over the world. It goes alright, Crash escapes, his girlfriend is still in captivity, go save her and stop Cortex. Kinda dumb, but inoffensive all the same. With that out of the way, time to get into the important stuff. Gameplay-wise, Crash Bandicoot is pretty much the typical linear platformer, just with an extra axis as opposed to the exploratory gameplay provided by Super Mario 64 and the like. Crash's moveset is very basic, with jumping and spinning being your only moves, and depending on the circumstance, both can be used as offensive maneuvers. Most of the time, a spin can probably do the job, but there are some enemies that will not be having that and will push you back if you try to spin into them. Even with how basic these controls are, they can be a bit problematic at times. When you let go of the direction you're pressing, Crash will often end up carrying a bit of momentum, especially in midair. This makes precise jumps harder than they should ideally be, which goes from being a mild nuisance in sections where you have to progress vertically via these springy boxes, to being fatal in sections with ultra-precise platforming, such as the infamous High Road. This quirk feels out of place when this isn't a highly momentum-driven game, and the level design feels very traditional. Well, as traditional as you could reasonably expect from one of the earliest linear 3D platformers. A lot of the challenge in this game comes from using your movements, jumps, and spins with proper timing and getting a feel for when it would be dangerous to move ahead. There's a good variety of enemies and hazards that the game throws at you, and they tend to be placed and telegraphed well. You've got plants trying to eat you, giant leaves on rivers to ride across, stone roars that can crush you, giant boulders that can crush you, toxic waste barrels that can crush you, and much, much more. Perhaps the most unique are the segments where, after cocking his eyebrows in a weird way, Crash takes control of a hog and rides at speeds previously unknown to him. These are probably the most trial and error heavy parts of the whole game, although the rest of it can come off as very difficult. This is largely compensated for through the abundance of extra lives and Wumpa fruits. Collect 100 of those for an extra life. The bosses, though, don't really adhere very closely to this sense of difficulty. They're overall decent, but hardly anything special. What's worth noting is that the bosses in this game give you 2 extra hit points by default, a trait that would be lost in the sequels. Papu Papu is basically a new Super Mario Bros. Boss. Jump on him 3 times while avoiding a basic attack. Ripperoo has an interesting setup with having to blow him up by jumping on big TNT crates, but in execution it's pretty basic. Koala Kong is beaten by hitting back boulders while avoiding TNT crates. That'll teach you not to skip leg day. Pinstripe is a decent challenge with you having to hide behind chairs. And Brio might be the most interesting simply because he has a second phase where he turns into the Incredible Hulk, I guess. But the final battle against Cortex is short and easy, and not a very good final encounter. Bosses aside, this can be a tricky game to beat, as I've said, and I'm sure many people can appreciate that, especially since the challenge doesn't seem unfair. Unfortunately, that same challenge loses a lot of its sweetness due to one archaic design choice. Saving the game is more complicated and infrequent than it should be. The most common method to save your progress is getting the 3 Tana icons and completing the bonus stage they unlock. While finding 3 Tana icons is easily doable if you care to break the boxes, it's possible that you'll end up failing the bonus stage and thus losing the chance to save. It's a bizarre design choice since games that didn't need better saving functionality ended up having it years earlier. Also, isn't Tana supposed to be kidnapped? What is she doing in these bonus games? You also get a password at each save point, and I never use them since they work basically the same way. The other method of saving is getting one of the gems, which serve as the bulk of the game's optional content. How do you get these? Finish the stage with every box broken and without dying once. The boxes are to this game what blocks are to Mario. Breaking them or jumping on them gets you Wumpa Fruits, Aku Aku masks, first two act as extra hit points and the third gives you temporary invincibility, and extra lives. There are also TNT crates that can only be safely dispatched by jumping on them and getting the heck away before they blow up. And in this game, to get 100% completion, you have to break every single one of them in a deathless run in every single level in the game. Sounds like fun, eh? I spent 20 minutes getting the gem in the first level because you have to break every single one of these boxes that form a bridge over a bottomless pit. And if you do so much as fall in, you have to start from the very beginning of the level. And that's only the first level. There's even more of this in nearly every level in the game. Now, even though this is only my third proper review on this channel, I can already foresee those "get good you moron" type comments when I say that, and I will admit that optional content is subjective when it comes to any game. It's supposed to be hard since it's something you're most likely going to try and obtain after you've overcome the game's skill curve. It's not forced on you just to beat the game and get some sort of proper ending, so you shouldn't rate the game lower for it, you might say. I get it. In fact, I do enjoy 100% completion in some other games because of how brutal it can be, and maybe I'd appreciate it more here if I wasn't pushing myself to do it before the end of the month. Why am I making all this seem like a big gameplay flaw then? Admittedly, it's mostly hindsight bias, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The graphics look superb for a 1996 release, with colorful, lush, and detailed environments and solid character animation, Crash's choppy landing animation notwithstanding. The level theming isn't the most creative and varied though. Most of the stages have some variation on either the jungle theme or the high-tech theme. I'm not crazy for the music either. To my ears, it feels a bit sparse and empty, mostly going for ambiance but not having much of a catchy hook. If you dig the musical style though, then I can understand that since all of the music at least sounds fine to listen to. If I'm being honest, the first Crash game didn't really do a whole lot for me. It's a fun time, but aside from its 2D to 3D format, it doesn't do very much to stand out for its time, and the issues with the controls and the save function hold it back from being a game I'd imagine I'd play all the way through on a regular basis. Fortunately, in these regards, the sequel, Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back, picks up some of the slack. That kinda rhymes. Picking up exactly where the first game left off, Cortex falls into a cave and finds a big purple crystal. A year later, Cortex needs more crystals like it to power the latest evil scheme. Meanwhile, while looking for an extra battery for his sister Coco's laptop, Crash finds himself in a warp room where Cortex tells him to find the crystal, supposedly to help him save the world. Right. This warp room contains one of the biggest improvements Crash 2 makes over its predecessor, the ability to save your progress in between levels. Just makes it even more apparent that it was a flaw in the original. The bonus rooms are still present in this game though, but they work a little differently. Instead of having to collect 3 Tana icons to access them, they are now accessed simply by standing on these question mark platforms, and you're given unlimited tries at these. These tweaks are welcome, but I also feel like they make the bonus rooms less satisfying to reach. I mean, getting the Tana tokens in the first game was so easy that I think I got them every time, but I would have liked a similar system with these bonus rooms to make them feel like less of a gimme. I would still keep the ability to try them infinitely, and I'll elaborate on why later on. Beyond that, the warp room signifies Cortex Strikes Back's change in structure. There are 5 warp rooms now, and each has 5 levels that can be taken on in any order. Beat all of them and you get a boss fight. Gone is the overworld map of the first game, and in its place is the ability to jump on a baby polar bear for extra lives. The controls have seen some much needed tightening since the last game, removing the weird gradual slowing down present in the first game. Crash's jumping especially feels better since you can stop in midair more easily. As if that wasn't enough, there are a few new moves that are activated by pressing the circle button. Crouching and crawling are the most basic and least useful.
When I'm crouching, you can make me do the duck walk!
The slide move is pretty cool, giving you whole new approaches to defeating enemies and also letting you do a slightly higher jump out of it. You can also do this high jump by jumping out of a crouch. Last but not least is the body slam, which has a wide radius, making it fun to break boxes with. Frustration isn't just reduced with the controls and save feature either. If you die to a certain section of a level enough times, the game will give you an extra Aku Aku mask to help you through. There's also even more variety to be found in Cortex Strikes Back than in Crash 1. Breaks from the action in the form of riding levels and chase levels return, now featuring more polar bears than ever before. I mean, they're more adorable than wild hogs, so I'll take it. There are even some improvements made to them, like how Crash Dash has boost pads to speed you up and bombs to slow you down. Beyond that, there are little sections where you ride on a jet ski and have to avoid whirlpools, as well as sections where you fly around in a jetpack. Give me a second. But it doesn't just stop with the vehicles. There's a new box type, the Nitro Box, which automatically inflicts damage upon touch. There are plenty of new enemies, like saw blade turtles and those stupid bees. There are parts where you climb across the ceiling, which are fortunately not too slow paced. There are parts with slippery floors. Well, you win some, you lose some. Yeah, despite the considerable improvements over the first Crash Bandicoot though, Cortex Strikes Back does have a couple of rough spots. Collision detection is at times ambiguous, and some enemies would rush into me without much warning. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but moments like these feel more frequent in the sequel. But the worst offenders are these jetpack sections. Holy moly, I hate the controls for these so much. Whoever decided that up should be down and down should be up, well, I get it. It's what most flying games do. The thing is, in those you're steering the vehicle up and down, while here you're moving it up and down. It just doesn't feel right, combined with how much momentum is carried when you move in any direction, and I had to take these at a snail's pace. The bosses are also kinda worse than they are in the first game. The Komodo brothers just throw a bunch of swords that are easy to dodge. Ripperoo and Tiny Tiger are both variations on going to a different part of the stage over and over, which gets pretty tedious, especially when you make a tiny slip up and have to do it all over again. I do appreciate Engine having plenty of unique attacks and a unique way to be attacked, but it drags on for so long, and dying means you have to redo the entire battle all over again. The final battle with Cortex honestly reminds me of the Time Eater battle from Sonic Generations, in that you're chasing him down a big tube, and it's just as anticlimactic. You'd think that the added combat options would be a greater focus of these battles, but this doesn't seem to be the case. I've spent too much time being negative towards this game, so I guess I should think of something nice to say. Alright, the optional content. Much like the last game, Cortex Strikes Back has gems that are collected by breaking every single box in a level. This even includes the boxes in bonus rooms, which is why it's expedient to have unlimited tries at them. Fortunately, this game ditches the no death stipulation that made the last completionist journey so daunting. In its place are occasional entire no death routes, which are only accessible if you started a run of the stage and didn't die by the time you reached this skull and crossbones platform. Other than that, you can die as many times as you want and still get the gem, which is especially useful in the chase levels where you can't go back to break boxes you missed. Sadly, there are still some cryptic moments, such as having to not break a single box in the first level to get the blue gem, but for the most part this side quest is pretty fun. The presentation has also seen a buff. Crash looks a lot more textured than before and less polygonal, as do the other character models for that matter. His animations are a lot more dynamic now, and he has even more unique animation for each way in which he dies. There are also plenty of cutscenes between levels where Cortex, Coco, or Brio activate a hologram to tell Crash something, and the lip sync for these is excellent, even by today's standards. Level theming has been more diversified for this game, with some levels taking place in winter wonderlands, sewers, and even outer space. It's not like each one of them correlates to a warp room or anything, which is a double-edged sword. The backdrops constantly change throughout the journey, but also lack the sense of progression seen in the first game. Fortunately, they're accompanied by music that fits all the scenarios Crash sees himself in, with a fuller sound than what was seen in Crash 1. Let's compare boulders from the first game to Crash Dash from the second game. The fuller sound is fitting for the fuller levels. While Cortex Strikes Back is far from perfect, it perhaps improves and refines the base Crash gameplay formula the most it reasonably can. Once the sequel does that, the question becomes, where do we go from here? Indeed, how would Naughty Dog finish its hat trick of PS1 3D platformers? Well, let's look to Crash Bandicoot Warped for the answer to this. Many will swear by Cortex Strikes Back being the superior game. we'll see about that. This game actually includes a bit of world building at the beginning. Aku Aku has been Crash's companion since the beginning, providing you with extra hit points and invulnerability, but Warped establishes him as basically being the guardian of Crash and Coco. We're also introduced to his evil brother, Uka Uka, who Aku Aku imprisoned hundreds of years ago for his misdeeds. After the destruction of the Cortex Vortex, though, the evil mask is freed from its prison and assigns Entropy to ensure that Cortex can claim the crystals from past time periods. Now it's up to Crash and Coco to stop them. In terms of core gameplay, Crash 3 is mostly just Crash 2 again, with the slide, body slam, and other jazz still here and accounted for, although the slide move isn't quite as frequently needed to take down certain foes as in Crash 2. There are also a couple smaller tweaks to the base gameplay, like how pressing the triangle button shows not just how many boxes you've broken, but how many you've broken in proportion to how many there are in the stage, as well as some boxes that shuffle between what they drop. Otherwise, the levels and baseline game mechanics are business as usual after Cortex Strikes Back. Bonus rooms, death routes, and the like largely work the same here, implying that Naughty Dog handled these the best they could in the second game. So, what does this game add to stand out from Crash 2? For one thing, for each boss you beat, you get a new ability added to Crash's moveset. First is a more powerful body slam that lets you break metal boxes. Wait, couldn't you already do that with a regular body slam? Second is a double jump that's useful for platforming, but not exactly the most free form. Unlike some other double jumps I've seen before, you can't use this at any time in midair, just around the height of your jump. Third is the Death Tornado Spin, which lets you spin for longer and even briefly glide by mashing the square button. Fourth is the Fruit Bazooka, which feels unnatural compared to the other abilities, requiring you to stand still and aim to hit faraway enemies. Finally, after beating the game, you get the ability to sprint by holding R2. Ultimately, aside from the bonus rooms, which are optional anyways, these are rarely, if at all, needed to progress. More contentious is the inclusion of various vehicle segments in Crash 3. Added to the formula are a bunch more levels with different gameplay styles, and from what I can gather, these are the most commonly cited reasons to consider Cortex Strikes Back the superior game. The previous games had some of this: animal riding levels, which are here in the form of Coco riding Cora across the Great Wall of China, jet ski sections, which are in a way fleshed out here into full levels that provide a superb spin on the typical level structure, and jetpack levels, which aren't here at all. Thank goodness. However, Warped cranked it up even further by adding a few new ones to the mix. The scuba diving levels turned out better than I expected. In a way, they're kind of a 2D version of the jetpack gameplay, but I think the swimming, while a bit loose, is way more fun and controllable than that was. I feel a bit more negatively about the motorbike levels, where you have to race to the finish against a bunch of other drivers. I don't know if I'm doing something wrong, but the drifting feels really off and makes a lot of the sharp turns harder to make without slowing down too much, especially when boost pads seem to prevent you from doing so. It's a shame. If the handling felt more well-tuned to the course design, I'd probably have a really fun time with these. Also, the music for these sounds like one of the town mission tracks from Sonic 06. Then there are the biplane levels, which are probably my least favorite in the entire game. They drag on for way too long, and the depth to avoid getting mowed down by enemy fire just boils down to do a barrel roll! Overall, these are all more fun than the jetpack segments of Crash 2, but that's not saying a whole lot, and they're more frequent. On their own, they're more of a mixed success, with some I really enjoy and some I could do without. I would have to say that Warped handles the boss fights way better than Cortex Strikes Back on the whole. They're still not ideal since the slide and belly flop still aren't utilized here, but on the whole, I wouldn't call them tedious by any means. Dingodile in particular I had fun taking down. Reaching him involves making your way through the holes he blasts through his barriers, and then you have to make your way back through those barriers before his weapon self-destructs. Easily the most creative of all the circular arena style boss fights this series has provided so far. Tiny Tiger and Entropy are good tests of your jumping abilities, having to avoid lions and lasers alike. Shooting down Engine makes more sense this time since you're actually piloting a spaceship instead of just throwing fruit at him, I guess. It's still probably the weakest fight in the game for similar reasons to his Crash 2 incarnation. If you really want me to make a more positive comparison to Crash 2, the final battle against Cortex feels appropriately epic and challenging for a final encounter, as you have to avoid the struggle between Aku Aku and Uka Uka while knocking Cortex into the hole in the middle of the stage. Definitely a step up from the short and awkward final battle of Cortex Strikes Back. The last notable gameplay addition that Warped makes to the Crash formula is the time trial mode. while the optional content from the other Crash games, namely the gems, returns here. On top of that, the game lets you try to clear the levels as quickly as possible, which the sprint move obtained at the end helps out with. A certain type of relic, depending on how well you performed, is obtained with each time trial completed. Weirdly enough, despite the bad ending only mentioning the gems, you actually need to obtain a relic of some kind from each level to get the good ending. Aside from that, the gems and crystals work a lot like the last game, although I think that getting the gems is much less cryptic than it was back then. How about the presentation? Honestly, what can I say that I haven't already said? I will say first off that the level theming is definitely the strongest in the entire trilogy, involving a variety of different time periods and places like the Jurassic Era, Ancient Egypt, and the distant future. I don't exactly know how the crystals show up in the future, since the whole point of Uka Uka's plan was that they've been lost in the present and they need to go back in time to get them, like this is Avengers Endgame or something. But whatever. Aside from that, there are some technical improvements like proper shadow mapping for Crash and reflections on shiny surfaces, but the graphics and music are otherwise about as good as they were last time. Detailed backgrounds, good character models, solid use of color, etc. I suppose it's subjective as to whether or not the boss's trash-talking you is an improvement over Cortex telling you to gather the crystals, but that won't affect my conclusion. Overall, I understand why people prefer Cortex Strikes Back over Warped since the former is more of a pure Crash experience. If I had to go back to either though, it would probably be Warped since I don't mind what it adds to the experience and it improves on some aspects like the boss fights and optional content. With that said, I guess that about does it for the original Crash Bandicoot trilogy. While these games probably aren't for everybody, for what they are, they hold up surprisingly well over 2 decades later. They've got some very solid design and mechanics for an early 3D platformer, which is especially impressive considering Naughty Dog had so little experience developing this kind of game at the time, and despite my quibbles, I'm glad that I can finally say I've experienced them. I guess that sets me up to review Crash 4, eh? Not unless someone gives me a free PS4 with the game or something. I guess that ends my Newcomer's perspective on Crash Bandicoot, so I hope you enjoyed hearing it. Next time though, I think I'll give a perspective on something that I'm not a newcomer to at all, something that I've known for a good amount of time now. I hope I'm ready. I can already foresee those "get good, you moron." I can't. I can already. Give me a minute. I can't do it. I can't.